All right. Welcome, Suzie. It's so wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for the invitation. Happy to be here, Susan.
Absolutely. So for people who may not be familiar with you and your work, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself to us and let us know what your work is based in and what you're working on now.
Sure. So project-based learning has been my wheelhouse for probably the last couple of decades. I've written a number of books on that topic. Made a bit of a shift. My most recent book is called Redefining Student Success, which has PBL at the core, but my co-author Ken Kay and I really looked at, what are those new goals for students? How are communities really rethinking what students need to be ready for the future? And so right at the heart of that book are a whole series of project examples where students are doing amazing things, often interdisciplinary, often incorporating the arts to solve problems. So that was a little bit of a shift for me, still very project focused, but a little broader reach.
Yeah. So I just finished an interview with Rowan Gibson, who talked all about school innovation. So I'm curious on your take on school innovation, because if there's ever a time to innovate schools, it would be now, right? So how do you redefine student success and how do we innovate schools?
Sure. And so I think first I have to say, I don't redefine. I think it's up to each community to decide for itself. And it's really as the whole community, including student voices, including parents, including nonprofit business, communities of practice, as communities around the world are doing this. Our look really went global. And my work in PBL has taken me around the world as well. And so as communities are refocusing on what do we need students to be ready for, what skills and competencies do they need for whatever future they imagine, each community needs to come up with its own understanding, often kind of communicated in a graphic way as a portrait of a graduate, thinking about this is kind of the full complex picture of what our students need to be ready for. Not that they're being shoehorned into the same profile, but that there are certain essential skills all students need to kind of seize the moment for themselves. So I think this is the big shift, that needs to be a really strong community conversation, full stakeholder engagement. And then as you look at these goals from one community to the next, there's always a core of very similar, understandings of students need to be critical thinkers and creative problem solvers. But each community then brings its own take on, where I live in Portland, Oregon, being a really strong advocate for the environment matters a lot. Other communities are taking global citizenship on as a challenge that their students, or leadership. So each community has a little different take. And then, interestingly, from the arts perspective, a different way of communicating that graphically so that everybody kind of gets a sense of, oh, I see where we're going.
Yeah.
Where we need to go. Yeah.
This is fascinating to me. So particularly on this idea of reimagining perhaps what our schools look like, because much of what you're describing, I've seen starting to play out in magnet schools and some charter schools. But what you're talking about, is this possible in public schools, do you think?
I think it's not only possible, but essential. We just, this is what education needs to be for all kids. And I think that's the equity message in this work, that it can't just be, we've seen over the last couple of decades that I've been doing this work, there are always pockets of wonderful things happening, pockets of excellence. And as you said, special schools that reach only a certain population of kids where fantastic learning experiences are unfolding. But if we really mean that education is about preparing all students for the future they imagine, they all need this experience of, kind of growing into the competencies that really matter. Otherwise, we're going to have not just the achievement gaps that we have now, but what my co-author Ken Kay and I talk about as opportunity gaps. Kids are not going to be equally ready, to seize the moment and create their futures and solve the problems they care about if they don't, grow into these competencies that are so important.
I completely agree. I think it's this is such a timely message, Suzie, because I'm seeing it play out in real time. I have a 13-year-old, and I also have nieces and nephews who are right around that age as well as younger. And I'm watching this opportunity gap that you're talking about playing out in real time, depending on where they go to school, even within our own district. So that's really interesting. I'm going to ask a question, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, but at least we could chat about it. What happens if the community that a school is in disagrees or has a different viewpoint of what is needed in the schools than maybe the teachers in those schools do? Because I know that that's happening in my community right now.
Sure. And, things are contentious in some districts across the country. We're seeing these kind of debates and presentations, let's call them, at school board meetings that can get kind of hot, kind of hostile. And I think that the goal for district leadership in particular, is to figure out how to be a consensus builder. If there are differences of opinions and understanding, this is where the leadership team really needs to lean into those conversations. Maybe there's some shared experiences that are necessary to build understanding of what's ahead. I mean, we've seen some really creative ways that districts have done this and have gotten through those divisive conversations. Everything from sending the adults back to school for a day, having them shadow students, and then asking them, okay, how did your day prepare you for the future that you want your students to experience? Or bringing students into that conversation and having them talk about what really matters to them, or having them sometimes facilitate conversations with adults, which is fascinating to see happen if the kids are prepared for that. If they understand what it means to hear different points of view and bring in evidence and bring people together into some shared understanding. So it's not necessarily an easy conversation. This idea of get your community together and, have a chat about it. It's work, and it takes time. It takes really good listening skills. And as I said, it sometimes requires a shared experience. Some communities bring in guest speakers, or they do a film screening that's provocative. And then, that starts the conversation of, don't we want this for our kids? Don't we want this for all kids? So it takes work. It's not a quick and easy thing to do. But it's just, I think some of the best work to reset, what do we mean by school? Who's it for? Who's it serving? How can it serve all kids better?
I love this. So I'm going to get to PBL. I promise you. We're going to talk about PBL. I'm just so, I just find this work so important, particularly right now. I guess maybe my last question around this process, and redefining student success would be, what happens when the community organically changes what they value and what they feel as though is going to prepare students for the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say this whole process of creating a portrait of the graduate is pretty new yet. And a lot of communities are just at that stage of, by our estimate, only about 10% of public school systems in the U.S. have done this work. And so that, it's still pretty new. But what I'm finding particularly in schools that have had a portrait for a while, they tend to revisit it because you have new parents, new students, new teachers joining. And so you need to revisit it, have that conversation again, fine tune it if necessary. Does this still meet the moment? Is this still what we want for our students? And if not, how does it need to shift? So it's not something written in stone and this is the only way forward. I think so many of the portraits that we're seeing emerge are about students being adaptable and flexible and resilient and nimble. So, of course, that means everybody in the system needs to have that mindset of being able to respond to change. And, communities do change. Sometimes major employers leave or new opportunities emerge or startups, pop up in a community. And so sometimes there's a different need for thinking about how do we prepare kids, or, how do we hold on to our students. Some of our rural communities are really keen on figuring out how do we help our kids see that this is going to be a place to stay and be adults who contribute to the community. So I think that sense of being adaptable is right at the heart of this.
Oh, perfect. That's great. So I'm going to do that pivot over to PBL, since that has been a large portion of your work in the last several decades. So I'm curious, how did you start on your journey with PBL, and how did you pivot from that to this?
Sure. Interesting. So, I kind of have had a non-traditional path, I guess, into the work that I'm doing now. Before I was involved in education, before I was a teacher myself, I was a newspaper reporter. Mm-hmm. And my academic background is in journalism and, work that I love and still continue to find my way to writing as much as I can. But because I'd been a newspaper reporter before I was a teacher and made a shift into teaching journalism, running a publishing center, I set it up the way a newsroom felt. So I didn't have the lingo of PBL. I hadn't really, dug into that as a pedagogy. I just knew that if we wanted this to be authentic and if we wanted students to have a real audience, they needed to do the work that journalists do. So they needed to get out of class, they needed to interview people, they needed to work together, have a real audience, which made the kids I worked with made their learning experience a little different. We were kind of outliers, in a pretty traditional system. Then fast forward a little bit, another phase in my career, I shifted from my own classroom to working for a research organization where I got to combine the two things that I really loved, a passion for education and particularly helping students find their voice, express themselves, and continuing my work as a writer. So in my research lab capacity, I had this great opportunity to go into the field, visiting, I would say, hundreds of classrooms and watching and observing and documenting good practice in action. So the expert researchers, the PhDs in the world of education, they were defining from a research standpoint, here's what's effective, here's what we know works. And my job was to go find that. What does that look like in practice when, great things are happening? As technology became, I'm dating myself a bit and going back a couple decades, but as technology became more pervasive, more available, how were schools using that effectively? How were students using that to communicate and create and connect and all those things? So that led me deeply into the world of PBL. Because the teachers who were doing, I think, some of the most promising early work, especially around technology integration, were doing project-based learning. So I really needed to understand that at a deep level, did a big deep dive for one project. I think I interviewed 300 teachers who were doing technology integration well, and almost to a person, they were doing project-based learning. So that got me kind of deep into it, and I wound up doing some kind of spinning off and doing some writing on my own and kind of harnessing all that I've been learning. And I'm continuing to do that work, have been ever since. And I've just had the great pleasure of working with educators now on just about every continent. I haven't been to Africa, but just about every other continent where there's interest in project-based learning and where I'm still looking for those great stories to tell of here's what it looks like, in different contexts. Here's what it looks like at different ages in different content areas.
So for people who may not be familiar with project-based learning, can you give a brief overview of what quality PBL does look like?
Yeah, and I think quality is the key word there. So when I think of what makes for a really high quality PBL, and I should add a lot of my thinking about this has been informed by my long standing relationship with PBL Works, an organization in the U.S. I was on their national faculty for a long time and did some of my books are published with them. And we did a big deep dive into what makes for high quality project-based learning. So that teachers trying to do this kind of work, making a shift in their practice to something more student-centered, could get off to a faster start. If you know what good looks like, then you can kind of aim toward that. So for me, it needs to start with a really interesting, open-ended challenge or question that kids are going to care about. So a question that you can't go Google, you can't look it up in a textbook, and it requires learning something and then applying what you learn. So deep dive into understanding some concepts, building that conceptual understanding, and then doing that higher level thinking of applying what you've learned to create a product or a solution, somehow, use what you've learned to solve this problem, and then communicate it with an audience. Audience can be a big hall full of people, or it can be a small group or one really interested person who's your client for problem solving. But in some way, the work that students are doing in the process of learning gets communicated outside the classroom. And for students, generally, we hear that this is what makes a big difference. It leads to deeper engagement. They care more. They're not just doing it for a grade. They have a purpose. They're not thinking about when will I ever need to learn this or know this, because they know it's going to matter. Either I'm solving a problem for a client, or I'm trying to convince an audience about an issue that matters to me and I've had some new understandings into, or whatever it might be. And we can talk about some examples. But for me, those are the things that really make it work worth doing, and that puts the project right at the heart of the curriculum. It's not something extra or added on or done after the real learning happens. It is the route to deep learning.
Yeah. And so much of what you're sharing is very similar to what we advocate for with arts integration and STEAM. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think PBL and STEAM and arts integration, they work in tandem together and strengthen one another, right?
Yes, absolutely. That Venn diagram, lots and lots of overlap there.
Yeah, absolutely. And because sometimes we'll have people come to us and say, well, what's the difference between STEAM and PBL? And there are certainly distinctions, but I think they work so well together, especially that point of inquiry, making it real, making it hands-on and project-based, and having students solving a problem is something that's so critical. Do you find, I know that we find this with STEAM and the misperceptions of STEAM and STEM versus projects that just happen to use, tools to create something, but not necessarily something of value, let's say. Do you find that there are misperceptions with PBL versus projects?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm. and I think that's part of the kind of broader education that needs to happen around PBL. For today's parents, certainly people of my age, my kids are grown and out of the house, but I think if most of today's parents who have kids in school, if they hear project-based learning, they think, oh, we did that. We did those dioramas. Mm-hmm. We did that. We made something out of sugar cubes. They think that it's this kind of fun activity that happened after the serious learning was over. That's what projects have been treated, as in the past. And I think you've probably seen that a lot in the STEM world where, it's an activity, but unless it has all of those components, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with hands-on learning, making sometimes a diorama is the best way to create a model that you want to share with the real audience. But unless the experience has all of those other components, unless it has inquiry built in, unless it has students making decisions and having voice and choice, unless it requires students to really dig in and research and ask questions in the way that experts do in different disciplines and bring that understanding to solve a problem and share it with an audience. Unless it's all of that, it's not project-based learning. It might be a great activity. Can I share a quick example?
Oh, please. I was just going to ask if you could share an example. That would be great.
And sometimes you can take those activities and think about how could I grow this into a project. There's a great, I've done some writing and work with Edutopia over the years. And one of their wonderful videos about arts integration showcases a project where they're elementary students who are going to be learning on the content side about the forces of flight. So they need to understand about drag and lift and all those things that keep planes up in the air. And in the past, this teacher has taught that by doing a paper airplane contest, which is really fun, but has no authentic audience, not a lot of critique and revision. They just make airplanes and see who goes the furthest, and fun activity. Hooray, we're done. Moving on. Instead, they do a deep dive and they have kids go to the airport, and these are little guys, interview adults. Do you know why your plane is going to stay up in the air? What's going to keep your plane flying? And the adults are just dumbfounded. Most of them, they have no idea. They trust somebody knows. Some pilot or engineer, somebody has figured this out. But clearly, the adults they talk to do not understand the forces of flight in the way that these kids are learning. So they decide they're going to educate passengers and reassure them that their planes are going to stay up by creating artwork that requires the use of drag and lift. And so they begin studying different artists. They're, you can see them learning about Kandinsky and, artists who dropped paint, from above and lift. You can see there's a moment where they lift a canvas and the paint flows, and they're understanding now about gravity and flow. I remember sharing this video with a bunch of arts integrators, and that moment where the kids tilted the canvas and they saw and they connected it to the forces of gravity and flow and all that. There was just this, oh my gosh, they are experiencing it. And then they created this art exhibit that they curated and explained how do they use all these different forces to create their art, and how does that apply to airplanes. So what a difference. And guess what? In the middle of that project, which is extended, they still did that paper airplane contest because it was a fun activity that let them do some trial and error and, use some of the things they were thinking about. But it was just one activity over the course of an extended inquiry experience. So for me, that's a nice example of activity versus project-based learning.
Absolutely. So what do you say to people who are concerned about needing a lot of money to, again, enter into the world of PBL? We get that all the time with STEAM. Like, we have to spend all this money to buy these materials. How would you answer something like that?
Yeah, well, if I'm doing work around the world, I talk about frugal innovation, which is something you hear about in countries like India and Africa. They have, whole terms of art around, kind of doing something with nothing, making the most use, reusing materials, and literally solving problems with very scarce materials. So I think it's a big misperception that you have to have a fancy setup or be in a fancy school or have access to the latest and greatest, 3D printers in order to do meaningful work. You use what's available. And you use it in a creative way. This is part of where creativity comes to the fore. You may not be able to create the final finished product, but you can make a pretty rockin' prototype out of reused materials and cardboard and, going from there. So it's not about having an unlimited budget or the need for an unlimited budget. It's really about more unlimited creativity. How can we use what we have at hand to solve a problem?
And I think I certainly find so much truth in that. I also think that the idea of projects being richer because you have limited resources, and also providing equity, because we talk about the equity part of the conversation a lot, of schools that have budgets and schools that don't. But the idea of the PBL framework can exist in both places as an equitable access piece.
Absolutely. Right? And really has to, I think, that, and I think for kids who have been disconnected in school for whatever reason, disengaged, not very excited about learning, if they get involved in a project that they really care about, that just, the learning accelerates, because they have a sense of purpose. They're in it for the long haul. They want to put their best work forward. And I think that can really drive, student achievement in lots of ways. Yeah.
Last part about PBL, I think, how can educators who work with special needs students, maybe English language learners, or even students of exception, how can these educators also participate in PBL and have it be meaningful for those students?
Sure. And I think one of the best things you can do as a teacher, if you have a specialist in your building or in your district who can partner with you in project planning and anticipate, thinking of particular students and what might those special needs be that we need to either accommodate or scaffold for in the project. If you can do that planning in advance, great. If they can be involved during the project, even better. But I think for every teacher, you want to think about creating opportunities for every student in your room to grow. They're all starting at different places, but you want them all to show some growth and to be able to meet appropriate goals by the end of the project. So you design the project with learning goals in mind, and you think about those goals. Are they appropriate? Do we need some accommodation for students? Do we need to stretch some students, set, different goals for some students? And so you're thinking about that in the project design. And then you're thinking about, how can I scaffold this so that every student can be successful? You mentioned language learners, one, of course, large population. Thinking about a project where students were designing tiny houses for a client. They were elementary students. A lot of the kids in the classroom were language learners. So before the project began, the teacher was wise enough to have the students who were language learners create their own kind of picture dictionaries around architectural terms that were going to be could have been a barrier for their understanding as they got into reading material, as they got into talking with architects. That you wanted all students to be able to engage in those conversations and in the literacy work. So they had, kids who needed that scaffold create these picture dictionaries. But guess what happens during the project then? Those kids became experts in the language of architecture. So on their mixed ability teams, they could weigh in and say, oh, I can help us understand this term. And look, here's my drawing that illustrates, what that looks like. So I think anticipating what those kind of challenge spots, pinch points in the project might be, being ready for that. Some kids may need some pre-work to get ready. Some may need some scaffolds in the moment. And chances are all of my educator friends who are experts, in working with inclusion, they remind us that often scaffolds that you design for some students are often useful for all students. Mm-hmm. So there can be multiple benefits.
Absolutely. The whole UDL component. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. So I have one last question, which I ask all of my guests, which is if there's one thing that you'd like us to know about PBL or creativity or innovation, what would that be?
Boy, what a great question. So I guess if I think of the term, the creative process, what I would want everyone to know is it is a process that's learnable, and teachable. And then I think we have this misconception that only some people are creative, or some are innately creative and others aren't. But I think what everyone can learn is that there's a process for problem solving, and you can help students from a very young age. And I've seen this work with kids as young as, primary grades. Understand that you can ask questions in a certain way. You can pull together diverse perspectives. You can figure out, how have people solved this before, and how could I build on prior knowledge and maybe do something, bring some ideas together, or maybe come up with something even newer that nobody's thought of before, and then improve that. How can I get feedback on this and improve it and make another draft? I'm not going to just make one draft and be done. And then I'm going to think about what I'm learning along the way. So I think if we understand that it's this really rich process that's all about learning, and if we keep that at the heart of what's going on in project-based learning, or STEAM or STEM, or any of the other labels we want to put on this kind of learning, I think then students are going to emerge from those experiences as more confident problem solvers, and realizing, I never thought of myself as an artist before, maybe a student might say, but I know I'm a problem solver. And I know how to bring people together to solve problems that matter to us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Suzie. How can people stay in touch with you?
I'm active on social media. So I'm at Suzie Boss on Twitter. SuzieBoss.com is my website. You can find out where I'm going to be and keep up to date on things that I've been working on.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Suzie. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Susan.
Sure.